Second essay. Guilt, bad conscience, and related matters. 1. To breed an animal with the prerogative to promise, is that not precisely the paradoxical task which nature has set herself with regard to humankind? Is it not the real problem of humankind? The fact that this problem has been solved to a large degree must seem all the more surprising to the person who can fully appreciate the opposing force, forgetfulness. Forgetfulness is not just a vis inertiae, as superficial people believe, but is rather an active ability to suppress, positive in the strongest sense of the word, to which we owe the fact that what we simply live through, experience, take in, no more enters our consciousness during digestion, one could call it spiritual ingestion, than does the thousandfold process which takes place with our physical consumption of food, our so-called ingestion. To shut the doors and windows of consciousness for a while, not to be bothered by the noise and battle with which our underworld of serviceable organs work with and against each other. A little peace, a little tabula rasa of consciousness to make room for something new, above all for the nobler functions and functionaries, for ruling, predicting, predetermining. Our organism runs along oligarchic lines, you see. That, as I said, is the benefit of active forgetfulness, like a doorkeeper or guardian of mental order, rest, and etiquette, from which we can immediately see how there could be no happiness, cheerfulness, hope, pride, immediacy without forgetfulness. The person in whom this apparatus of suppression is damaged, so that it stops working, can be compared, and not just compared, to a dyspeptic. He cannot cope with anything, and precisely this necessarily forgetful animal, in whom forgetting is a strength, representing a form of robust health, has bred for himself a counter-device, memory, with the help of which forgetfulness can be suspended in certain cases, namely, in those cases where a promise is to be made. Consequently, it is by no means merely a passive inability to be rid of an impression once it has made its impact, nor is it just indigestion caused by giving your word on some occasion and finding you cannot cope. Instead, it is an active desire not to let go, a desire to keep on desiring what has been, on some occasion, desired. Really, it is the will's memory, so that a world of strange new things, circumstances, and even acts of will may be placed quite safely in between the original I will, I shall do, and the actual discharge of the will, its act, without breaking the long chain of the will. But what a lot of preconditions there are for this. In order to have that degree of control over the future, man must first have learnt to distinguish between what happens by accident and what by design, to think causally, to view the future as the present and anticipate it, to grasp with certainty what is end and what is means, in all, to be able to calculate, compute, and before he can do this, man himself will really have to become reliable, regular, necessary, even in his own self-image, so that he, as someone making a promise, is answerable for his own future. 2. That is precisely what constitutes the long history of the origins of responsibility. That particular task of breeding an animal with the prerogative to promise includes, as we have already understood, as precondition and preparation, the more immediate task of first making man, to a certain degree, necessary, uniform, a peer among peers, orderly and consequently predictable. The immense amount of labor involved in what I have called the morality of custom, see Daybreak, Part 1, the actual labor of man on himself during the longest epoch of the human race, his whole prehistoric labor is explained and justified on a grand scale, in spite of the hardness, tyranny, stupidity, and idiocy it also contained, by this fact. With the help of the morality of custom and the social straitjacket, man was made truly predictable. Let us place ourselves, on the other hand, at the end of this immense process where the tree actually bears fruit, where society and its morality of custom finally reveal what they were simply the means to. We then find the sovereign individual as the ripest fruit on its tree, like only to itself, having freed itself from the morality of custom, an autonomous, supra-ethical individual, because autonomous and ethical are mutually exclusive. In short, we find a man with his own independent, enduring will, whose prerogative it is to promise, and in him a proud consciousness, quivering in every muscle of what he has finally achieved and incorporated, an actual awareness of power and freedom, a feeling that man in general has reached completion. This man who is now free, who actually has the prerogative to promise, this master of the free will, this sovereign, how could he remain ignorant of his superiority over everybody who does not have the prerogative to promise or answer to himself? How much trust, fear, and respect he arouses. He merits all three. And how could he, with his self-mastery, not realize that he has necessarily been given mastery over circumstances, over nature, and over all creatures with a less enduring and reliable will? The free man, the possessor of an enduring, unbreakable will, thus has his own standard of value. In the possession of such a will, viewing others from his own standpoint, he respects or despises. And just as he will necessarily respect his peers, the strong and the reliable, those with the prerogative to promise, that is, everyone who promises, like a sovereign, ponderously, seldom, slowly, and is sparing with his trust, who confers an honor when he places his trust, who gives his word as something that can be relied on, because he is strong enough to remain upright in the face of mishap, or even in the face of fate. So he will necessarily be ready to kick the febrile whippets who promise without that prerogative, and will save the rod for the liar who breaks his word in the very moment it passes his lips. The proud knowledge of the extraordinary privilege of responsibility, the consciousness of this rare freedom and power over himself and his destiny, has penetrated him to his lowest depths and become an instinct, his dominant instinct. What will he call his dominant instinct, assuming that he needs a word for it? No doubt about the answer. This sovereign human being calls it his conscience. 3. His conscience? We can presume in advance that the concept conscience, which we meet here in its highest, almost disconcerting form, already has a long history and metamorphosis behind it. To be answerable to oneself, and proudly too, and therefore to have the prerogative to say yes to oneself is, as I said, a ripe fruit, but also a late fruit. How long must this fruit have hung, bitter and sour, on the tree? And for even longer there was nothing to see of this fruit. Nobody could have promised it would be there, although it is certain that everything about the tree was ready and growing towards it. How do you give a memory to the animal, man? How do you impress something upon this partly dull, partly idiotic, inattentive mind, this personification of forgetfulness, so that it will stick? This age-old question was not resolved with gentle solutions and methods, as can be imagined. Perhaps there is something more terrible and strange in man's prehistory than his technique of mnemonics. A thing must be burnt in so that it stays in the memory. Only something that continues to hurt stays in the memory. That is a proposition from the oldest, and unfortunately the longest-lived, psychology on earth. You almost want to add that wherever on earth you still find ceremonial, solemnity, mystery, gloomy shades in the lives of men and peoples, something of the dread with which everyone, everywhere, used to make promises, give pledges and commendation, is still working. The past, the most prolonged, deepest, hardest past, breathes on us and rises up in us when we become solemn. When man decided he had to make a memory for himself, it never happened without blood, torments, and sacrifices. The most horrifying sacrifices and forfeits, the sacrifice of the firstborn, belongs here. The most disgusting mutilations, for example, castration, the cruelest rituals of all religious cults, and all religions are, at their most fundamental, systems of cruelty. All this has its origin in that particular instinct which discovered that pain was the most powerful aid to mnemonics. In a certain sense, the whole of asceticism belongs here. A few ideas have to be made ineradicable, ubiquitous, unforgettable, fixed, in order to hypnotize the whole nervous and intellectual system through these fixed ideas. And ascetic procedures and lifestyles are a method of freeing those ideas from competition with all other ideas, of making them unforgettable. The worse man's history has been, the more dreadful his customs have appeared. In particular, the harshness of the penal law gives a measure of how much trouble it had in conquering forgetfulness, and preserving a few primitive requirements of social life in the minds of these slaves of the mood and desire of the moment. We Germans certainly do not regard ourselves as a particularly cruel or hard-hearted people, still less as particularly irresponsible and happy-go-lucky. But you only have to look at our old penal code in order to see how difficult it was on this earth to breed a nation of thinkers, by which I mean the nation in Europe that still contains the maximum of reliability, solemnity, tastelessness, and sobriety, qualities which give it the right to breed all sorts of European Mandarin. These Germans made a memory for themselves with dreadful methods, in order to master their basic plebeian instincts and the brutal crudeness of the same. Think of old German punishment such as stoning. Even the legend drops the millstone on the guilty person's head. Breaking on the wheel, a unique invention and speciality of German genius in the field of punishment. Impaling, ripping apart, and trampling to death by horses. Quartering, boiling of the criminal in oil or wine, still in the 14th and 15th centuries. The popular flaying, cutting strips, cutting out flesh from the breast, and of course, coating the wrongdoer with honey and leaving him to the flies in the scorching sun. With the aid of such images and procedures, man was eventually able to retain 5 or 6 I don't want tos in his memory, in connection with which a promise had been given, in order to enjoy the advantages of society. And there you are, with the aid of this sort of memory, people finally came to reason. Reason, solemnity, mastering of emotions, this really dismal thing called reflection, all these privileges and splendors man has. What a price had to be paid for them. How much blood and horror lies at the basis of all good things. 4. How then did that other dismal thing, the consciousness of guilt, the whole bad conscience, come into the world? And with this we return to our genealogists of morality. I'll say it again, or maybe I haven't said it yet. They are no good. No more than 5 spans of their own, merely modern experience. No knowledge and no will to know the past, still less an instinct for history, a second sight so necessary at this point. And yet they go in for the history of morality. Of course, this must logically end in results that have a more than brittle relationship to the truth. Have these genealogists of morality up to now ever remotely dreamt that, for example, the main moral concept, Schuld, guilt, descends from the very material concept of Schulden, debts, or that punishment, as retribution, evolved quite independently of any assumption about freedom or lack of freedom of the will? And this to the point where a high degree of humanization had first to be achieved, so that the animal man could begin to differentiate between those much more primitive nuances, intentional, negligent, accidental, of sound mind, and their opposites, and take them into account when dealing out punishment. That inescapable thought, which is now so cheap and apparently natural, and which has had to serve as an explanation of how the sense of justice came about at all on earth, the criminal deserves to be punished because he could have acted otherwise, is actually an extremely late and refined form of human judgment and inference. Whoever thinks it dates back to the beginning is laying his coarse hands on the psychology of primitive man in the wrong way. Throughout most of human history, punishment has not been meted out because the miscreant was held responsible for his act. Therefore, it was not assumed that the guilty party alone should be punished, but rather, as parents still punish their children, it was out of anger over some wrong that had been suffered, directed at the perpetrator. But this anger was held in check and modified by the idea that every injury has its equivalent, which can be paid in compensation, if only through the pain of the person who injures. And where did this primeval, deeply rooted, and perhaps now ineradicable idea gain its power? This idea of an equivalence between injury and pain? I have already let it out, in the contractual relationship between creditor and debtor, which is as old as the very conception of a legal subject, and itself refers back to the basic forms of buying, selling, bartering, trade, and traffic. 5. To be sure, thinking about these contractual relationships, as can be expected from what has gone before, arouses all kinds of suspicion and hostility towards the primitive men who created them or permitted them. Precisely here, promises are made. Precisely here, the person making the promise has to have a memory made for him. Precisely here, we may suppose, is a repository of hard, cruel, painful things. The debtor, in order to inspire confidence that the promise of repayment will be honored, in order to give a guarantee of the solemnity and sanctity of his promise, and in order to etch the duty and obligation of repayment into his conscience, pawns something to the creditor by means of the contract in case he does not pay, something that he still possesses and controls, for example, his body or his wife or his freedom or his life, or, in certain religious circumstances, even his afterlife, the salvation of his soul, finally, even his peace in the grave, as in Egypt, where the corpse of a debtor found no peace from the creditor, even in the grave, and this peace meant a lot precisely to the Egyptians. But in particular, the creditor could inflict all kinds of dishonor and torture on the body of the debtor, for example, cutting as much flesh off as seemed appropriate for the debt. From this standpoint, there were everywhere, early on, estimates which went into horrifyingly minute and fastidious detail, legally drawn up estimates for individual limbs and parts of the body. I regard it as a definite progress and proof of a freer, more open-handed calculation, of a more Roman pricing of justice, when Rome's code of the 12 tables decreed that it did not matter how much or how little a creditor cut off in such a circumstance. Si plus minusve sequerunt ne fraude esto. If they have cut off more or less, let that not be considered a crime. Let's be quite clear about the logic of this whole matter of compensation. It is strange enough. The equivalence is provided by the fact that instead of an advantage directly making up for the wrong, so instead of compensation in money, land, or possessions of any kind, a sort of pleasure is given to the creditor as repayment and compensation, the pleasure of having the right to exercise power over the powerless without a thought, the pleasure de faire le mal pour le plaisir de le faire, to do evil for the pleasure of doing it, the enjoyment of violating, an enjoyment that is prized all the higher, the lower and baser the position of the creditor in the social scale, and which can easily seem a delicious titbit to him, even a foretaste of higher rank. Through punishment of the debtor, the creditor takes part in the rights of the masters. At last he, too, shares the elevated feeling of being in a position to despise and maltreat someone as an inferior. Or, at least, when the actual power of punishment, of exacting punishment, is already transferred to the authorities, of seeing the debtor despised and maltreated. So, then, compensation is made up of a warrant for and entitlement to cruelty. 6. In this sphere of legal obligations, then, the moral conceptual world of debt, conscience, duty, sacred duty, has its breeding ground. all began with a thorough and prolonged bloodletting, like the beginning of all great things on earth. And may we not add that this world has really never quite lost a certain odor of blood and torture? Not even with old Kant, the categorical imperative smells of cruelty. In the same way, it was here that the uncanny and perhaps inextricable link-up between the ideas of debt and suffering was first crotcheted together. I ask again, to what extent can suffering be a compensation for debts? To the degree that to make someone suffer is pleasure in its highest form, and to the degree that the injured party received an extraordinary counter-pleasure in exchange for the injury and distress caused by the injury. To make someone suffer. A true feast, something that, as I mentioned, rose in price the more it contrasted with the rank and social position of the creditor. I say all this in speculation, because such subterranean things are difficult to fathom out, besides being embarrassing, and anyone who clumsily tries to interject the concept revenge has merely obscured and darkened his own insight, rather than clarified it. Revenge itself just leads us back to the same problem. How can it be gratifying to make someone suffer? It seems to me that the delicacy, and even more the tartuffery of tame house pets, meaning modern man, meaning us, revolts against a truly forceful realization of the degree to which cruelty is part of the festive joy of the ancients, and indeed is an ingredient in nearly every pleasure they have. On the other hand, how naive and innocent their need for cruelty appears, and how fundamental is that disinterested malice, or to use Spinoza's words, the sympathia malevolens, they assume is a normal human attribute, making it something to which conscience says a hearty yes. A more piercing eye would perhaps be able to detect, even now, plenty of these most primitive and basic festive joys of man. In Beyond Good and Evil 7, section 229, earlier in Daybreak 1, sections 1877-113, I pointed a wary finger at the ever-growing intellectualization and deification of cruelty, which runs through the whole history of higher culture, and indeed constitutes it in an important sense. At all events, not so long ago, it was unthinkable to hold a royal wedding or full-scale festival for the people without executions, tortures, or perhaps an auto da fe. Similarly, no noble household was without creatures on whom people could discharge their malice and cruel taunts with impunity. Remember Don Quixote, for example, at the court of the Duchess. Today we read the whole of Don Quixote with a bitter taste in the mouth. It is almost an ordeal, which would make us seem very strange and incomprehensible to the author and his contemporaries. They read it with a clear conscience as the funniest of books. It made them nearly laugh themselves to death. To see suffering does you good. To make suffer, better still. That is a hard proposition, but an ancient, powerful, human, all too human proposition to which, by the way, even the apes might subscribe. As people say, in thinking up bizarre cruelties, they anticipate, and, as it were, act out a demonstration of what man will do. No cruelty, no feast. That is what the oldest and longest period in human history teaches us. And punishment, too, has such very strong festive aspects. 7. By the way, these ideas certainly don't make me wish to help provide our pessimists with new grist for their discordant and creaking mills of disgust with life. On the contrary, I expressly want to place on record that, at the time when mankind felt no shame towards its cruelty, life on earth was more cheerful than it is today, with its pessimists. The heavens darkened over man in direct proportion to the increase in his feeling shame at being man. The tired, pessimistic outlook, mistrust of life's riddle, the icy no of nausea at life, these are not signs of the wickedest epoch of the human race. On the contrary, they come to light as the bog plants they are, only in their natural habitat, the bog. I mean, the sickly mollycoddling and sermonizing, by means of which the animal man is finally taught to be ashamed of all his instincts. On the way to becoming an angel, not to use a stronger word here, man has upset his stomach and developed a furry tongue, so that he finds not only that the joy and innocence of animals is disgusting, but that life itself is distasteful. So that every now and again he is so repelled by himself that he holds his nose and disapprovingly recites a catalogue of his offensive features, with Pope Innocent III, conception in filth, loathsome method of feeding in the womb, sinfulness of the raw material of man, terrible stench, secretion of saliva, urine, and excrement. Now, when suffering is always the first of the arguments marshalled against life, as its most questionable feature, it is salutary to remember the times when people made the opposite assessment, because they could not do without making people suffer, and saw first-rate magic in it, the veritable seductive lure to life. Perhaps pain, I say this to comfort the squeamish, did not hurt as much then as it does now. At least, a doctor would be justified in assuming this. If he had treated a Negro, taken as a representative, or primeval man, for serious internal inflammations, which would drive the European with the stoutest constitution to distraction. They do not do that to Negroes. The curve of human capacity for pain actually does seem to sink dramatically and almost precipitously beyond the first 10,000 or 10 million of the cultural elite. And for myself, I do not doubt that in comparison with one night of pain, endured by a single hysterical blue stocking, the total suffering of all the animals who have been interrogated by the knife in scientific research is as nothing. Perhaps I can even be allowed to admit the possibility that pleasure and cruelty does not really need to have died out. Perhaps, just as pain today hurts more, it needed, in this connection, some kind of sublimation and subtilization. It had to be transformed into the imaginative and spiritual, and adorned with such inoffensive names that they do not arouse the suspicion of even the most delicate, hypocritical conscience. Tragic pity is one such name, another is les nostalgies de la croix. What actually arouses indignation over suffering is not the suffering itself, but the senselessness of suffering. But neither for the Christian, who saw in suffering a whole hidden machinery of salvation, nor for naive man in ancient times, who saw all suffering in relation to spectators or to instigators of suffering, was there any such senseless suffering. In order to rid the world of concealed, undiscovered, unseen suffering, and deny it in all honesty, people were then practically obliged to invent gods and intermediate beings at every level. In short, something that also roamed round in obscurity, which could see in the dark, and which would not miss out on an interesting spectacle of pain so easily. With the aid of such inventions, life then played the trick it has always known how to play, of justifying itself, justifying its evil. Nowadays it might need rather different inventions to help it. For example, life as a riddle, life as a problem of knowledge. All evil is justified if a god takes pleasure in it. So ran the primitive logic of feeling. And was this logic really restricted to primitive times? The gods viewed as the friends of cruel spectacles. How deeply this primeval concept still penetrates into our European civilization. Maybe we should consult Calvin and Luther on the matter. At all events, the Greeks could certainly think of offering their gods no more acceptable a side dish to their happiness than the joys of cruelty. So how do you think Homer made his gods look down on the fortunes of men? What final, fundamental meaning did the Trojan War and similar tragic atrocities have? We can be in no doubt. They were intended to be festivals for the gods. And, to the extent that the poet has a more godlike nature in these matters, probably festivals for the poets, too. It was no different when later Greek moral philosophers thought that the eyes of the gods still looked down on moral struggles, on the heroism and self-inflicted torture of the virtuous. The Heracles of duty was on stage and knew it, Unwitnessed virtue was something inconceivable for this nation of actors. Might it not be the case that that extremely foolhardy and fateful philosophical invention, first devised for Europe, of the free will, of man's absolute freedom, spontaneitat, to do good or evil, was chiefly thought up to justify the idea that the interest of the gods in man's virtue, could never be exhausted? On the stage of this earth, there would never be any lack of real novelty, real unheard-of suspense, intrigues, catastrophes. A world planned on completely deterministic lines would have been predictable, and therefore soon boring for the gods. Sufficient reason for these friends of the gods, the philosophers, not to impute a deterministic world of that sort to their gods. Everybody in antiquity is full of tender consideration for the spectator. People in antiquity form an essentially public, essentially visible world, incapable of conceiving happiness without spectacles and feasts. And, as already stated, severe punishment, too, has very strong festive features. 8. The feeling of guilt, of personal obligation, to pursue our train of inquiry again, originated, as we saw, in the oldest and most primitive personal relationship there is, in the relationship of buyer and seller, creditor and debtor. Here person met person for the first time, and measured himself person against person. No form of civilization has been discovered which is so low that it did not display something of this relationship. Fixing prices, setting values, working out equivalents, exchanging, this preoccupied man's first thoughts to such a degree that in a certain sense it constitutes thought. The most primitive kind of cunning was bred here, as was also, presumably, the first appearance of human pride, man's sense of superiority over other animals. Perhaps our word man, manas, expresses something of this first sensation of self-confidence. Man designated himself as the being who measures values, who values and measures, as the calculating animal as such. Buying and selling, with their psychological trappings, are older even than the beginnings of any social form of organization or association. It is much more the case that the germinating sensation of barter, contract, debt, right, duty, compensation was simply transferred from the most rudimentary form of the legal rights of persons to the most crude and elementary social units, in their relations with similar units, together with the habit of comparing power with power, of measuring, of calculating. Now, the eye was focused in this direction in any case, and with the ponderous consistency characteristic of the ancients' way of thinking, which, though difficult to get started, never deviated once it was moving, man soon arrived at the great generalization. Everything has its price. Everything can be compensated for. The oldest, most naive canon of morals relating to justice, the beginning of all good-naturedness, equity, all goodwill, all objectivity on earth. Justice at this first level is the goodwill between those who are roughly equal, to come to terms with each other, to come to an understanding, again by means of a settlement, and, in connection with those who are less powerful, to force them to reach a settlement amongst themselves. 9. Still measuring with the standard of prehistoric times, a prehistory which, by the way, exists at all times, or could possibly reoccur. The community has the same basic relationship to its members as the creditor to the debtor. You live in a community. You enjoy the benefits of a community. Oh, what benefits! Sometimes we underestimate them today. You live a sheltered, protected life in peace and trust, without any worry of suffering certain kinds of harm and hostility to which the man outside, the man without peace, is exposed. A German understands what misery, Elend, originally means. You make pledges and take on obligations to the community with just that harm and hostility in mind. What happens if you do not. The community, the cheated creditor, will make you pay up as best it can. You can be sure of that. The immediate damage done by the offender is what we are talking about least. Quite apart from this, the lawbreaker is a breaker, somebody who has broken his contract and his word to the whole, in connection with all the valued features and amenities of communal life that he has shared up till now. The lawbreaker is a debtor who not only fails to repay the benefits and advances granted to him, but also actually assaults the creditor. So, from now on, as is fair, he is not only deprived of all these valued benefits, he is now also reminded how important these benefits are. The anger of the injured creditor, the community, makes him return to the savage and outlawed state from which he was sheltered hitherto. He is cast out, and now any kind of hostile act can be perpetrated on him. Punishment, at this level of civilization, is simply a copy, a mimesis, of normal behavior towards a hated, disarmed enemy who has been defeated and who has not only forfeited all rights and safeguards, but all mercy as well. In fact, the rules of war and the victory celebration of Vae Victis in all their mercilessness and cruelty, which explains the fact that war itself, including the warlike cult of the sacrificial victim, has given us all forms in which punishment manifests itself in history. 10. As a community grows in power, it ceases to take the offense of the individual quite so seriously, because these do not seem to be as dangerous and destabilizing for the survival of the whole as they did earlier. The wrongdoer is no longer deprived of peace and cast out, nor can the general public vent their anger on him with the same lack of constraint. Instead, the wrongdoer is carefully shielded by the community from this anger, especially from that of the immediate injured party, and given protection. A compromise with the anger of those immediately affected by the wrongdoing, and therefore an attempt to localize the matter and head off further or more widespread participation and unrest. Attempts to work out equivalence and settle the matter, the compositio. Above all, the will manifesting itself ever more distinctly, to treat every offence as being something that can be paid off, so that, at least to a certain degree, the wrongdoer is isolated from his deed. These are the characteristics imprinted more and more clearly into penal law in its further development. As the power and self-confidence of a community grows, its penal law becomes more lenient. If the former is weakened or endangered, harsher forms of the latter will re-emerge. The creditor always becomes more humane as his wealth increases. Finally, the amount of his wealth determines how much injury he can sustain without suffering from it. It is not possible to imagine society so conscious of its power that it could allow itself the noblest luxury available to it, that of letting its malefactors go unpunished. What do I care about my parasites? It could say, let them live and flourish. I am strong enough for all that. Justice, which began by saying everything can be paid off, everything must be paid off, ends by turning a blind eye and letting off those unable to pay. It ends, like every good thing on earth, by sublimating itself. The self-sublimation of justice, we know what a nice name it gives itself. Mercy. It remains, of course, the prerogative of the most powerful man, better still, his way of being beyond the law. 11. Now a derogatory mention of recent attempts to seek the origin of justice elsewhere, namely in ressentiment, a word in the ear of the psychologists, assuming they are inclined to study ressentiment close up for once. This plant thrives best among anarchists and anti-Semites today, so it flowers like it always has done, in secret, like a violet but with a different scent. And just as like always gives rise to like, it will come as no surprise to find attempts coming once more from these circles, as so often before. See section 14, essay 1, above, to sanctify revenge with the term justice, as though justice were fundamentally simply a further development of the feeling of having been wronged, and belatedly to legitimize with revenge emotional reactions in general, one and all. The latter is something with which I least take issue with regard to the whole biological problem, where the value of these emotions has been underestimated up till now, I even view it as a merit. All I want to point out is the fact that this new nuance of scientific balance, which favors hatred, envy, resentment, suspicion, rancune, and revenge, stems from the spirit of ressentiment itself. This scientific fairness immediately halts and takes on aspects of a deadly animosity and prejudice the minute it has to deal with a different set of emotions, which, to my mind, are of much greater biological value than those of reaction, and therefore truly deserve to be scientifically valued, highly valued, namely the actual active emotions, such as lust for mastery, greed, and the like. During the value of life, a course in philosophy, basically all of it. So much for my general objections to this tendency. But concerning Düring's specific proposition that the seat of justice is found in the territory of reactive sentiment, for the sake of accuracy, we must unceremoniously replace this with another proposition. The last territory to be conquered by the spirit of justice is that of reactive sentiment. If it actually happens that the just man remains just even towards someone who has wronged him, and not just cold, moderate, remote, and indifferent, to be just is always a positive attitude. If the just and judging eye, gazing with a lofty, clear objectivity, both penetrating and merciful, is not dimmed even in the face of personal injury, of scorn and suspicion, well, that is a piece of perfection, the highest form of mastery to be had on earth, and even something that we would be wise not to expect, and should certainly find difficult to believe. Certainly, on average, even a small dose of aggression, malice, or insinuation is enough to make the most upright man see red and drive moderation out of his sight. The active, aggressive, overreaching man is still 100 paces nearer to justice than the man who reacts. He simply does not need to place a false and prejudiced interpretation on the object of his attention, like the man who reacts does, has to do. In fact, this explains why the aggressive person, as the stronger, more courageous, nobler man, has always had a clearer eye, a better conscience on his side. On the other hand, it is easy to guess who has the invention of bad conscience on his conscience, the man of ressentiment. Finally, just cast your eye around in history. In what sphere, up till now, has the whole treatment of justice and the actual need for justice resided? With men who react, perhaps? Not in the least, but with the active, the strong, the spontaneous, and the aggressive. Historically speaking, justice on earth represents, I say this to the annoyance of the above-mentioned agitator, who himself once confessed, "The doctrine of revenge has woven its way through all my works and activities as the red thread of justice." The battle, then, against reactive sentiment, the war waged against the same on the part of active and aggressive forces, which have partly expended their strength in trying to put a stop to the spread of reactive pathos, to keep it in check and within bounds, and to force a compromise with it. Everywhere that justice is practiced and maintained, the stronger power can be seen looking for means of putting an end to the senseless ravages of ressentiment amongst those inferior to it, whether groups or individuals, partly by lifting the object of ressentiment out of the hands of revenge, partly by substituting for revenge a struggle against the enemies of peace and order, partly by working out compensation, suggesting, sometimes enforcing it, and partly by promoting certain equivalences for wrongs into a norm which ressentiment from now on has to take into account. The most decisive thing, however, that the higher authorities can invent and enforce against the even stronger power of hostile and spiteful feelings, and they do it as soon as they are strong enough, is the setting up of a legal system, the imperative declaration of what counts as permissible in their eyes, as just, and what counts as forbidden, unjust. Once the legal code is in place, by treating offense and arbitrary actions against the individual or groups as a crime, as violation of the law, as insurrection against the higher authorities themselves, they distract attention from the damage done by such violations, and ultimately achieve the opposite of what revenge sets out to do, which just sees and regards as valid the injured party's point of view. From then on, the eye is trained for an ever more impersonal interpretation of the action, even the eye of the injured party, although, as stated, this happens last. Therefore, just and unjust only start from the moment when a legal system is set up, and not, as Dühring says, from the moment when the injury is done. To talk of just and unjust as such is meaningless. An act of injury, violence, exploitation, or destruction cannot be unjust as such, because life functions essentially in an injurious, violent, exploitative, and destructive manner, or at least these are its fundamental processes, and it cannot be thought of without these characteristics. One has to admit to oneself something even more unpalatable, that viewed from the highest biological standpoint, states of legality can never be anything but exceptional states, as partial restrictions to the true will to life, which seeks power, and to whose overall purpose they subordinate themselves as individual measures, that is to say, as a means of creating greater units of power. A system of law conceived as sovereign and general, not as a means for use in the fight between units of power, but as a means against fighting in general, rather like Dühring's communistic slogan, that every will should regard every other will as its equal, this would be a principle hostile to life, an attempt to assassinate the future of man, a sign of fatigue, and a secret path to nothingness. 12. Now another word on the origin and purpose of punishment. Two problems which are separate, or ought to be. Unfortunately, people usually throw them together. How have the moral genealogists reacted so far in this matter? Naively, as is their wont. They highlight some purpose in punishment, for example, revenge or deterrence, then innocently place the purpose at the start, as causa fiendi of punishment, and have finished. But purpose in law is the last thing we should apply to the history of the emergence of law. On the contrary, there is no more important proposition for every sort of history than that which we arrive at only with great effort, but which we really should reach, namely, that the origin of the emergence of a thing and its ultimate usefulness, its practical application and incorporation into a system of ends are toto coelo separate. That anything in existence, having somehow come about, is continually interpreted anew, requisitioned anew, transformed and redirected to a new purpose by a power superior to it. That everything that occurs in the organic world consists of overpowering, dominating, and in their turn, overpowering and dominating consist of reinterpretation, adjustment, in the process of which their former meaning, Sinn, and purpose must necessarily be obscured or completely obliterated. No matter how perfectly you have understood the usefulness of any physiological organ, or legal institution, social custom, political usage, art form, or religious rite, you have not yet thereby grasped how it emerged. Uncomfortable and unpleasant as this may sound to more elderly ears, for people down the ages have believed that the obvious purpose of a thing, its utility, form, and shape are its reason for existence, the eye is made to see, the hand to grasp. So people think punishment has evolved for the purpose of punishing, but every purpose and use is just a sign that the will to power has achieved mastery over something less powerful and has impressed upon it its own idea, Sinn, of a use function. And the whole history of a thing, an organ, a tradition, can to this extent be a continuous chain of signs, continually revealing new interpretations and adaptations, the causes of which need not be connected even amongst themselves, but rather sometimes just follow and replace one another at random. The development of a thing, a tradition, an organ, is therefore certainly not its progressus towards a goal. Still less is it a logical progressus, taking the shortest route with least expenditure of energy and cost. Instead, it is a succession of more or less profound, more or less mutually independent processes of subjugation exacted on the thing. Added to this, the resistances encountered every time, the attempted transformations for the purpose of defense and reaction, and the results, too, of successful countermeasures. The form is fluid, the meaning, sin, even more so. It is no different inside any individual organism. Every time the whole grows appreciably, the meaning, sin, of the individual organs shifts. Sometimes the partial destruction of organs, the reduction in their number, for example by the destruction of intermediary parts, can be a sign of increasing vigor and perfection. To speak plainly, even the partial reduction in usefulness, decay and degeneration, loss of meaning, sin, and functional purpose, in short, death, make up the conditions of true progressus, always appearing, as it does, in the form of the will and way to greater power, and always emerging victorious at the cost of countless smaller forces. The amount of progress can actually be measured according to how much has had to be sacrificed to it. Man's sacrifice en bloc to the prosperity of one single stronger species of man, that would be progress. I lay stress on this major point of historical method, especially as it runs counter to just that prevailing instinct and fashion which would much rather come to terms with absolute randomness and even the mechanistic senselessness of all events than the theory that a power will is acted out in all that happens. The democratic idiosyncrasy of being against everything that dominates and wants to dominate, the modern misochism, to coin a bad word for a bad thing, has gradually shaped and dressed itself up as intellectual, most intellectual, so much so that it already today, little by little, penetrates the strictest, seemingly most objective sciences, and is allowed to do so. Indeed, I think it has already become master of the whole of physiology and biology, to their detriment, naturally, by spiriting away their basic concept, that of actual activity. On the other hand, the pressure of this idiosyncrasy forces adaptation into the foreground, which is a second-rate activity, just a reactivity. Indeed, life itself has been defined as an increasingly efficient inner adaptation to external circumstances. Herbert Spencer. But this is to misunderstand the essence of life, its will to power. We overlook the prime importance that the spontaneous, aggressive, expansive, reinterpreting, redirecting, and formative forces have, which adaptation follows only when they have had their effect. In the organism itself, the dominant role of these highest functionaries, in whom the life will is active and manifests itself, is denied. One recalls what Huxley reproached Spencer with, his administrative nihilism. But we are dealing with more than administration. 13. To return to our topic, namely punishment, we have to distinguish between two of its aspects. One is its relative permanence, the custom, the act, the drama, a certain strict sequence of procedures. The other is its fluidity, its meaning, sin, purpose, and expectation, which is linked to the carrying out of such procedures. And here, without further ado, I assume, per analogiam, according to the major point of historical method just developed, that the procedure itself will be something older, predating its use as punishment, that the latter was only inserted and interpreted into the procedure, which had existed for a long time, though it was thought of in a different way. In short, that the matter is not to be understood in the way our naive, moral, and legal genealogists assumed up till now, who all thought the procedure had been invented for the purpose of punishment, just as people used to think that the hand had been invented for the purpose of grasping. With regard to the other element in punishment, the fluid one, its meaning, the concept punishment presents, at a very late stage of culture, for example in Europe today, not just one meaning, but a whole synthesis of meanings, sinnen. The history of punishment up to now in general, the history of its use for a variety of purposes, finally crystallizes in a kind of unity which is difficult to dissolve back into its elements. Difficult to analyze and, this has to be stressed, is absolutely undefinable. Today it is impossible to say precisely why people are actually punished. All concepts in which an entire process is semiotically concentrated defy definition. Only something which has no history can be defined. At an earlier stage, however, the synthesis of meanings appeared much easier to undo and shift. We can still make out how, in every single case, the elements of the synthesis change valence and alter the order in which they occur, so that now this, then that element stands out and dominates, to the detriment of the others. Indeed, in some circumstances, one element, for example, the purpose of deterrence, seems to overcome all the rest, to at least give an impression of how uncertain, belated, and haphazard the meaning of punishment is, and how one and the same procedure can be used, interpreted, and adapted for fundamentally different projects. You have here a formula that suggested itself to me on the basis of relatively restricted and random material. Punishment as a means of rendering harmless, of preventing further harm. Punishment as payment of a debt to the creditor in any form, even one of emotional compensation. Punishment as a means of isolating a disturbance of balance, to prevent further spread of the disturbance. Punishment as a means of inspiring the fear of those who determine and execute punishment. Punishment as a sort of counterbalance to the privileges which the criminal has enjoyed up till now, for example, by using him as a slave in the mines. Punishment as a rooting out of degenerate elements, sometimes a whole branch, as in Chinese law, whereby it becomes a means of keeping the race pure or maintaining a social type. Punishment as a festival, in the form of violating and mocking an enemy, once he is finally conquered. Punishment as an aide-mémoire, either for the person suffering the punishment, so-called reform, or for those who see it carried out. Punishment as payment of a fee stipulated by the power which protects the wrongdoer from the excesses of revenge. Punishment as a compromise with the natural state of revenge, insofar as the latter is still nurtured and claimed as a privilege by more powerful clans. Punishment as a declaration of war, and a war measure against an enemy of peace, law, order, authority, who is fought as dangerous to the life of the community, in breach of the contract on which the community is founded, as a rebel, a traitor, and a breaker of the peace, with all the means war can provide. 4. The list is certainly not complete. Punishment can clearly be seen to be richly laden with benefits of all kinds. This provides all the more justification for us to deduct one supposed benefit that counts as its most characteristic in popular perception. Faith in punishment, which is shaky today for several reasons, has its strongest support in precisely this. Punishment is supposed to have the value of arousing the feeling of guilt in the guilty party. In it, people look for the actual instrumentum of the mental reflex which we call bad conscience, or pang of conscience. But by doing this, people are violating reality and psychology, even as it is today, and much more so for the longest period in the history of mankind, its prehistory. The real pang of conscience, precisely amongst criminals and convicts, is something extremely rare. Prisons and jails are not nurseries where this type of gnawing pang chooses to thrive. On this, all conscientious observers are agreed, in many cases reaching such a conclusion reluctantly and against their personal inclinations. On the whole, punishment makes men harder and colder. It concentrates. It sharpens the feeling of alienation. It strengthens the power to resist. If it does happen that a man's vigor is broken, resulting in his wretched prostration and self-abasement, a result of this sort is certainly less edifying than the average effect of punishment, as characterized by a dry, morose solemnity. If we just think about those centuries before the history of mankind, we can safely conclude that the evolution of a feeling of guilt was most strongly impeded through punishment, at any rate with regard to the victims on whom the primitive measures were carried out. Nor must we underestimate the degree to which the mere sight of the judicial executive procedures inhibits the criminal himself from experiencing his act, his mode of conduct, as reprehensible as such, because he sees the same kind of action practiced in the service of justice and given approval, practiced with a good conscience, like spying, duping, bribing, setting traps, the whole intricate and wily skills of the policeman and prosecutor, as well as the most thorough robbery, violence, slander, imprisonment, torture, and murder, carried out without even having emotion as an excuse, all practices that are manifest in the various kinds of punishment, none of which is seen by his judges as a depraved and condemned act as such, but only in certain respects and applications. Bad conscience, the most uncanny and most interesting plant of our earthly vegetation, did not grow in this soil. In fact, for most of the time, it did not enter the consciousness of those who judged and punished that they were dealing with a guilty party. Instead, it was a question of someone who had caused harm, an irresponsible piece of fate, he himself the recipient of punishment, which again descended like a piece of fate, felt no inner pain beyond what he would feel if something unforeseen suddenly happened, a terrible natural disaster, a boulder falling on him and crushing him, where resistance is futile. 15. Spinoza became aware of this in a way that made him show his true colors, to the annoyance of his critics, who systematically attempt to misunderstand him on this point. Kuno Fischer, for example, when, one afternoon, rummaging around among who knows what memories, he turned his attention to the question of what actually remained for him, himself, of that famous morsus conscientiae, he who had relegated good and evil to man's imagination, and angrily defended the honor of his free God against the blasphemists who asserted that God operates everything sub ratione boni, to attain some good. But that would mean that God is subject to fate, and would really be the greatest of all absurdities. Spinoza, Ethics, Proposition 2. For Spinoza, the world had returned to that state of innocence in which it had lain before the invention of bad conscience. What then had become of morsus conscientiae, the opposite of gaudium, gladness, he finally said to himself, a sadness accompanied by the notion of a past event which turned out contrary to expectation. Ethics 3, Proposition 18. For millennia, wrongdoers overtaken by punishment have felt no different than Spinoza with regard to their offense. Something has gone unexpectedly wrong here, not, I ought not to have done that. They submitted to punishment as you submit to illness or misfortune or death, with that brave, unrebellious fatalism that still gives the Russians, for example, an advantage over us Westerners in the way they handle life. If in those days there was any criticism of the deed, it came from intelligence, which practiced criticism. We must certainly seek the actual effect of punishment, primarily in the sharpening of intelligence, in a lengthening of the memory, in a will to be more cautious, less trusting, to go about things more circumspectly from now on, in the recognition that one was, once and for all, too weak for many things, in a sort of improvement of self-assessment. What can largely be achieved by punishment, in man or beast, is the increase of fear, the intensification of intelligence, the mastering of desires. Punishment tames man in this way, but does not make him better. We would be more justified in asserting the opposite. You can learn from your mistakes, as the saying goes, but what you learn also makes you bad. Fortunately, it often enough makes you stupid. 16. At this point, I can no longer avoid giving a first, preliminary expression to my own theory on the origin of bad conscience. It is not easy to get a hearing for this hypothesis, and it needs to be pondered, watched, and slept on. I look on bad conscience as a serious illness to which man was forced to succumb by the pressure of the most fundamental of all changes which he experienced. That change whereby he finally found himself imprisoned within the confines of society and peace. It must have been no different for these semi-animals, happily adapted to the wilderness, war, the wandering life and adventure, than it was for the sea animals when they were forced to either become land animals or perish. At one go, all instincts were devalued and suspended. Now they had to walk on their feet and carry themselves, whereas they had been carried by the water up till then. A terrible heaviness bore down on them. They felt they were clumsy at performing the simplest task. They did not have their familiar guide any more for this new unknown world, those regulating impulses that unconsciously led them to safety. The poor things were reduced to relying on thinking, inference, calculation, and the connecting of cause with effect, that is, to relying on their consciousness. that most impoverished and error-prone organ. I do not think there has ever been such a feeling of misery on earth, such a leaden discomfort, and meanwhile the old instincts had not suddenly ceased to make their demands. But it was difficult and seldom possible to give in to them. They mainly had to seek new and, as it were, underground gratifications. All instincts which are not discharged outwardly turn inwards. This is what I call the internalization of man. With it there now evolves in man what will later be called his soul. The whole inner world, originally stretched thinly as though between two layers of skin, was expanded and extended itself, and gained depth, breadth, and height in proportion to the degree that the external discharge of man's instincts was obstructed. Those terrible bulwarks with which state organizations protected themselves against the old instincts of freedom, punishments are a primary instance of this kind of bulwark, had the result that all those instincts of the wild, free, roving man were turned backwards against man himself. Animosity, cruelty, the pleasure of pursuing, raiding, changing, and destroying, all this was pitted against the person who had such instincts. That is the origin of bad conscience. Lacking external enemies and obstacles, and forced into the oppressive narrowness and conformity of custom, man impatiently ripped himself apart, persecuted himself, gnawed at himself, gave himself no peace, and abused himself, this animal who battered himself raw on the bars of his cage, and who is supposed to be tamed. Man, full of emptiness and torn apart with homesickness for the desert, has had to create from within himself an adventure, a torture chamber, an unsafe and hazardous wilderness. This fool, this prisoner consumed with longing and despair, became the inventor of bad conscience. With it, however, the worst and most insidious illness was introduced, one from which mankind has not yet recovered. Man's sickness of man, of himself. As the result of a forcible breach with his animal past, a simultaneous leap and fall into new situations and conditions of existence, a declaration of war against all the old instincts on which, up till then, his strength, pleasure, and formidableness had been based. Let us immediately add that, on the other hand, the prospect of an animal soul turning against itself, taking a part against itself, was something so new, profound, unheard of, puzzling, contradictory, and momentous, zukunftsvolles, on earth, that the whole character of the world changed in an essential way. Indeed, a divine audience was needed to appreciate the spectacle that began then, but the end of which is not yet in sight. A spectacle too subtle, too wonderful, too paradoxical to be allowed to be played senselessly unobserved on some ridiculous planet. Since that time, man has been included among the most unexpected and exciting throws of dice played by Heraclitus's great child, call him Zeus or Fate. Heraclitus, fragment 52. He arouses interest, tension, hope, almost certainty for himself, as though something were being announced through him, were being prepared, as though man were not an end, but just a path, an episode, a bridge, a great promise. 17. The first assumption in my theory on the origin of bad conscience is that the alteration was not gradual and voluntary, and did not represent an organic assimilation into new circumstances, but was a breach, a leap, a compulsion, an inescapable fate that nothing could ward off, which occasioned no struggle, not even any ressentiment. The second assumption, however, is that the shaping of a population, which had up till now been unrestrained and shapeless, into a fixed form, as happened at the beginning with an act of violence, could only be concluded with acts of violence. That consequently the oldest state emerged as a terrible tyranny, as a repressive and ruthless machinery, and continued working until the raw material of people and semi-animals had been finally not just kneaded and made compliant, but shaped. I used the word state. It is obvious who is meant by this. Some pack of blonde beasts of prey, a conqueror and master race which, organized on a war footing, and with the power to organize, unscrupulously lays its dreadful paws on a populace which, though it might be vastly greater in number, is still shapeless and shifting. In this way, the state began on earth. I think I have dispensed with the fantasy which has it begin with a contract. Whoever can command, whoever is a master by nature, whoever appears violent in deed and gesture, what is he going to care about contracts? Such beings cannot be reckoned with. They come like fate, without cause, reason, consideration, or pretext. They appear just like lightning appears, too terrible, sudden, convincing, and other, even to be hated. What they do is to create and imprint forms instinctively. They are the most involuntary, unconscious artists there are. Where they appear, soon something new arises, a structure of domination that lives, in which parts and functions are differentiated and related to one another, in which there is absolutely no room for anything that does not first acquire meaning with regard to the whole. They do not know what guilt, responsibility, consideration are, these born organizers. They are ruled by that terrible inner artist's egoism, which has a brazen countenance, and sees itself justified to all eternity by the work, like the mother in her child. They are not the ones in whom bad conscience grew, that is obvious. But it would not have grown without them. This ugly growth would not be there if a huge amount of freedom had not been driven from the world, or at least driven from sight, and, at the same time, made latent by the pressure of their hammer blows and artists' violence. This instinct of freedom, forcibly made latent, we have already seen how. This instinct of freedom forced back, repressed, incarcerated within itself, and finally able to discharge and unleash itself only against itself. That, and that alone, is bad conscience in its beginnings. 18. We must be wary of thinking disparagingly about this whole phenomenon, because it is inherently ugly and painful. Fundamentally, it is the same active force as the one that is at work on a grand scale in those artists of violence and organizers, and that build states which here internally, and on a smaller, pettier scale, turned backwards, in the labyrinth of the breast, as Goethe would say. To the Moon, 1778. Creates bad conscience for itself, and builds negative ideals. It is that very instinct for freedom, put into my language, the will to power. Except that the material on which the formative and rapacious nature of this force vents itself is precisely man himself, his whole animal old self, and not, as in that greater and more eye-catching phenomenon, the other man, the other men. This secret self-violation, this artist's cruelty, this desire to give form to oneself as a piece of difficult, resisting, suffering matter, to brand it with a will, a critique, a contradiction, a contempt, a no, this uncanny, terrible, but joyous labor of a soul, voluntarily split within itself, which makes itself suffer out of the pleasure of making suffer. This whole active bad conscience has, finally, we have already guessed, as true womb of ideal and imaginative events, brought a wealth of novel, disconcerting beauty and affirmation to light, and perhaps for the first time beauty itself. What would be beautiful, if the contrary to it had not first come to awareness of itself, if ugliness had not first said to itself, I am ugly? At least, after this clue, one puzzle will be less puzzling, namely how an ideal, something beautiful, can be hinted at in self-contradictory concepts such as selflessness, self-denial, self-sacrifice, and furthermore. I do not doubt that we know one thing, what kind of pleasure it is which, from the start, the selfless, the self-denying, the self-sacrificing feel. This pleasure belongs to cruelty. So much, for the time being, on the descent of the unegoistic as a moral value. and on the delineation of the ground on which this value has grown. Only bad conscience, only the will to self-violation, provides the precondition for the value of the unegoistic. 19. Bad conscience is a sickness. There is no point in denying it, but a sickness rather like pregnancy. Let us examine the conditions under which this sickness reached its most terrible and sublime peak. We shall see what, with this, really entered the world. But we shall need a great deal of staying power, and first we have to return to an earlier point. The relationship of a debtor to his creditor in civil law, about which I have written at length already, was for a second time transformed through interpretation, in a historically extremely strange and curious manner, into a relationship in which it is perhaps least comprehensible to us modern men. That is the relationship of the present generation to their forebears. Within the original tribal association, we are talking about primeval times. The living generation always acknowledged a legal obligation towards the earlier generation, and in particular towards the earliest, which founded the tribe. And this was not just a sentimental tie. This latter could, with good reason, be denied altogether for the longest period of the human race. There is a prevailing conviction that the tribe exists only because of the sacrifices and deeds of the forefathers, and that these have to be paid back with sacrifices and deeds. People recognize an indebtedness, Schuld, which continually increases because these ancestors continue to exist as mighty spirits, giving the tribe new advantages and lending it some of their power. Do they do this for nothing, perhaps? But there is no for nothing for those raw and spiritually impoverished ages. What can people give them in return? Sacrifices, originally as food in the crudest sense, feasts, chapels, tributes, above all, obedience. For all traditions are, as works of the ancestors, also their rules and orders. Do people ever give them enough? This suspicion remains and grows. From time to time it exacts a payment on a grand scale, something immense as a repayment to the creditor, the infamous sacrifice of the firstborn, for example. Blood, human blood in any case. Following this line of thought, the dread of the ancestor and his power, the consciousness of debts towards him, increases inevitably, in direct proportion to the increase in power of the tribe itself, that is, in proportion as the tribe itself becomes ever more victorious, independent, honored and feared, and not the other way round. Every step towards the weakening of the tribe, all unfortunate calamities, all signs of degeneration and imminent disintegration, always lessen rather than increase the dread of the spirit of its founder, and lead to an ever lower opinion of his sagacity, providence, and powerful presence. If you think this sort of crude logic through to the end, it follows that through the hallucination of the growing dread itself, the ancestors of the most powerful tribes must have grown to an immense stature, and must have been pushed into the obscurity of divine mystery and transcendence. Inevitably, the ancestor himself is finally transfigured into a god. Perhaps we have here the actual origin of gods, an origin then in fear. And whoever should deem fit to add, but in piety too, would have difficulty in justifying the claim for the longest period of the human race, prehistory. All the more so, however, would he be right for the middle period in which the noble tribes developed, who actually did repay, with interest, their founders, their ancestors, heroes, gods, with all the attributes which, in the meantime, had become manifest in themselves, the noble attributes. Later we shall take another look at the way gods are ennobled and exalted, which is not at all to say they were hallowed, but let us for the present pursue the course of this whole development of the consciousness of guilt to its conclusion. 20. The awareness of having debts to gods did not, as history teaches, come to an end even after the decline of communities organized on the principle of blood relationship. Just as man inherited the concepts of good and bad from the nobility of lineage, together with its psychological basic tendency to institute orders of rank, he also inherited, along with the divinities of tribes and clans, the burden of unpaid debts, and the longing for them to be settled. Those large populations of slaves and serfs who adapted themselves to the divinity cults of their masters, whether through compulsion, submission, or mimicry, form the transitional stage. From them, the inheritance overflows in every direction. The feeling of indebtedness towards a deity continued to grow for several millennia, and indeed always in the same proportion as the concept of, and feeling for, God grew in the world and was carried aloft. The whole history of ethnic battles, victories, reconciliations, and mergers, and everything that precedes the eventual rank ordering of the diverse elements of the population in every great racial synthesis, is mirrored in the genealogical chaos of their gods, in the legends of their battles, victories, and reconciliations. The progression to universal empires is always the progress to universal deities at the same time. Despotism, with its subjugation of the independent nobility, always prepares the way for some sort of monotheism as well. The advent of the Christian God, as the maximal God yet achieved, thus also brought about the appearance of the greatest feeling of indebtedness on earth. Assuming that we have now started in the reverse direction, we should be justified in deducing, with no little probability, that from the unstoppable decline in faith in the Christian God there is, even now, a considerable decline in the consciousness of human debt. Indeed, the possibility cannot be rejected out of hand that the complete and definitive victory of atheism might release humanity from this whole feeling of being indebted towards its beginnings, its causa prima. Atheism and a sort of second innocence belong together. 21. So much for a brief and rough preliminary outline of the connection between the concepts debt, guilt, and duty, and religious precepts. I have so far intentionally set aside the actual moralization of these concepts, the way they are pushed back into conscience, more precisely, the way bad conscience is woven together with the concept of God. And at the conclusion of the last section, I actually spoke as though this moralization did not exist. Consequently, as though these concepts would necessarily come to an end once the basic premise no longer applied, the credence we lend our creditor, God. The facts diverge from this in a terrible way. With the moralization of the concepts debt, guilt, and duty, and their relegation to bad conscience, we have in reality an attempt to reverse the direction of the development I have described, or at least halt its movement. Now the prospect for a once-and-for-all payment is to be foreclosed out of pessimism. Now our glance is to bounce and recoil disconsolately off an iron impossibility. Now those concepts, debt and duty, are to be reversed. But against whom? It is indisputable. Firstly, against the debtor, in whom bad conscience now so firmly establishes itself, eating into him, broadening out and growing, like a polyp, so wide and deep that in the end, with the impossibility of paying back the debt, is conceived the impossibility of discharging the penance, the idea that it cannot be paid off, eternal punishment. Ultimately, however, against the creditor. And here we should think of the causa prima of man, the beginning of the human race, of his ancestor who is now burdened with a curse, Adam, original sin, the will in bondage, or of nature, from whose womb man originated, and to whom the principle of evil is imputed, diabolization of nature, nor of existence in general, which is left standing as inherently worthless, a nihilistic turning away from existence, the desire for nothingness, or desire for the antithesis, to be other, Buddhism and such like, until, all at once, we confront the paradoxical and horrifying expedient through which a martyred humanity has sought temporary relief, Christianity's stroke of genius. None other than God sacrificing himself for man's debt, none other than God paying himself back. God is the only one able to redeem man from what, to man himself, has become irredeemable. The creditor sacrificing himself for his debtor, out of love. Would you credit it? Out of love for his debtor. 22. You will already have guessed what has really gone on with all this, and behind all this, that will to torment oneself, that suppressed cruelty of animal man who has been frightened back into himself and given an inner life, incarcerated in the state to be tamed, and has discovered bad conscience so that he can hurt himself after the more natural outlet of this wish to hurt has been blocked. This man of bad conscience has seized on religious presupposition in order to provide his self-torture with its most horrific hardness and sharpness. Debt towards God, this thought becomes an instrument of torture. In God, he seizes upon the ultimate antithesis he can find to his real and irredeemable animal instincts. He reinterprets these self-same animal instincts as debt, guilt before God, as animosity, insurrection, rebellion against the master, the father, the primeval ancestor and beginning of the world. He pitches himself into the contradiction of God and devil. He emits every no which he says to himself, nature, naturalness, and the reality of his being as a yes, as existing, living, real, as God, as the holiness of God, as God the judge, as God the hangman, as the beyond, as eternity, as torture without end, as hell, as immeasurable punishment and guilt. We have here a sort of madness of the will showing itself in mental cruelty, which is absolutely unparalleled. Man's will to find himself guilty and condemned without hope of reprieve. His will to think of himself as punished, without the punishment ever being equivalent to the level of guilt. His will to infect and poison the fundamentals of things with the problem of punishment and guilt in order to cut himself off once and for all from the way out of this labyrinth of fixed ideas. This will to set up an ideal, that of a holy God, in order to be palpably convinced of his own absolute worthlessness in the face of this ideal. Alas, for this crazy, pathetic beast man. What ideas he has, what perversity, what hysterical nonsense, what bestiality of thought immediately erupts the moment he is prevented, if only gently, from being a beast indeed. This is all almost excessively interesting, but there is also a black, gloomy, unnerving sadness to it as well, so that one has to force oneself to forego peering for too long into these abysses. Here is sickness, without a doubt, the most terrible sickness ever to rage in man, and whoever is still able to hear, but people have no ear for it nowadays, how the shout of love has rung out during this night of torture and absurdity, the shout of the most yearning rapture of salvation through love, turns away, gripped by an unconquerable horror. There is so much in man that is horrifying. The world has been a madhouse for too long. 23. That should be enough, once and for all, about the descent of the holy God, that the conception of gods does not, as such, necessarily lead to that deterioration of the imagination which we had to think about for a moment, that there are nobler ways of making use of the invention of gods than man's self-crucifixion and self-abuse, ways in which Europe excelled during the last millennia. This can fortunately be deduced from any glance at the Greek gods, these reflections of noble and proud men in whom the animal in man felt deified, did not tear itself apart, and did not rage against itself. These Greeks, for most of the time, used their gods expressly to keep bad conscience at bay, so that they could carry on enjoying their freedom of soul. Therefore, the opposite of the way Christendom made use of its God. They went very far in this, these marvelous lion-hearted children, and no less an authority than the Homeric Zeus gives them to understand that they are making it too easy for themselves. Strange, he says on one occasion. He is talking about the case of Aegisthus, a very bad case. Strange how much the mortals complain about the gods. We alone cause evil, they claim, but they themselves, through folly, bring about their own distress, even contrary to fate. Odyssey, Book 1. Yet we can immediately hear and see that even this Olympian observer and judge has no intention of bearing them a grudge for this and thinking ill of them. How foolish they are is what he thinks when the mortals misbehave. Foolishness, stupidity, a little mental disturbance. This much even the Greeks of the strongest, bravest period allowed themselves as a reason for much that was bad or calamitous. Foolishness, not sin. You understand? But even this mental disturbance was a problem. Yes, how is this possible? Where can this have actually come from with minds like ours, we men of high lineage, happy, well-endowed, high-born, noble, and virtuous? For centuries, the noble Greek asked himself this in the face of any incomprehensible atrocity or crime with which one of his peers had sullied himself. A god must have confused him, he said to himself at last, shaking his head. This solution is typical for the Greeks. In this way, the gods served to justify man to a certain degree. Even if he was in the wrong, they served as causes of evil. They did not, at that time, take the punishment on themselves, but rather, as is nobler, the guilt. 24. I shall conclude with 3 question marks. That much is plain. Is an ideal set up or destroyed here, you might ask me. But have you ever asked yourselves properly how costly the setting up of every ideal on earth has been? How much reality always had to be vilified and misunderstood in the process? How many lies had to be sanctified? How much conscience had to be troubled? How much God had to be sacrificed every time? If a shrine is to be set up, a shrine has to be destroyed. That is the law. Show me an example where this does not apply. We moderns have inherited millennia of conscience vivisection and animal torture inflicted on ourselves. We have had most practice in it, are perhaps artists in the field. In any case, it is our raffinement and the indulgence of our taste. For too long man has viewed his natural inclinations with an evil eye, so that they finally come to be intertwined with bad conscience in him. A reverse experiment should be possible in principle, but who has sufficient strength? By this I mean an intertwining of bad conscience with perverse inclinations, all those otherworldly aspirations, alien to the senses, the instincts, to nature, to animals, in short, all the ideals which up to now have been hostile to life and have defamed the world. To whom should we turn with such hopes and claims today? We would have none other than the good man against us, and, as is fitting, the lazy, the complacent, the vain, the zealous, the tired. What is more deeply offensive to others and separates us more profoundly from them than allowing them to realize something of the severity and high-mindedness with which we treat ourselves? And again, how cooperative and pleasant everyone is towards us, as soon as we do as everyone else does, and let ourselves go like everyone else. For that purpose, we would need another sort of spirit than those we are likely to encounter in this age. Spirits who are strengthened by wars and victories, for whom conquest, adventure, danger, and even pain have actually become a necessity. They would also need to be acclimatized to thinner air higher up, to winter treks, ice and mountains in every sense. They would need a sort of sublime nastiness, Bosheit itself, a final, very self-assured willfulness of insight which belongs to great health, in brief. And unfortunately, they would need precisely this great health. Is this at all possible today? But sometime, in a stronger age than this mouldy, self-doubting present day, he will have to come to us, the redeeming man of great love and contempt, the creative spirit who is pushed out of any position outside or beyond by his surging strength again and again, whose solitude will be misunderstood by the people as though it were flight from reality, whereas it is just his way of being absorbed, buried, and immersed in reality, so that from it, when he emerges into the light again, he can return with the redemption of this reality, redeem it from the curse which its ideal had placed on it up till now. This man of the future will redeem us, not just from the ideal held up till now, but also from those things which had to arise from it, from the great nausea, the will to nothingness, from nihilism, that stroke of midday and of great decision that makes the will free again, which gives earth its purpose and man his hope again, this Antichrist, an anti-nihilist, this conqueror of God and of nothingness, he must come one day. 25. But what am I saying? Enough. Enough. At this point, just one thing is proper: silence. Otherwise, I shall be misappropriating something that belongs to another younger man, one with more future, one stronger than me, something to which Zarathustra alone is entitled. Zarathustra, the godless.